Rod Wheeler is the founder and CEO of the Global Food Defense Institute, the only global firm that focuses solely on food defense, international intentional adulteration, education, tampering investigations, and intelligence. Rod, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate that. And welcome to everyone that's listening in and watching this webinar. What we're going to talk about is food defense. But here's what we're going to really talk about. We're going to really talk about food defense and how does that measure up when it comes to regulation versus the reality. Now, as Laura just indicated, my background is law enforcement, and I've been doing food defense now for about 12 to 15 years. So I've done a number of vulnerability assessments at food plants, large and small, all around the world. So what I want to do on this webinar is share with each of you some of my experiences and then give you some good tips, some real, what I like to call real life tips that you can use if you're going to be conducting an audit or a vulnerability assessment at a food facility. Now, everything that I'm talking about, as we all know, and FSMA as a result, is a result of 9/11. The world changed 9/11 for all of our critical infrastructures, including our food and ag supply. The question and the challenge for each of us on this webinar today is simply this: how have you changed since 9/11? Or do you continue to do business the same way? You know, our country is experiencing different threats each and every day. So we all of us, from the auditor to the plant worker to the CEO, need to be more cognizant of what we're doing at our facilities, who's entering into our facilities, and making sure that we vetted those individuals that want to gain access to our food facilities. I want to start out by first just presenting an overview of food defense. The past, the present, and future of food defense. So we had the Bioterrorism Act in 2001, 2002, and I'm sure some of you all recall the Bioterrorism Act. And then in 2011, actually it was January 5th of 2011, President Obama signed the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is also known as FSMA. And this is the guiding document that all of us in the food and ag industry operate by. And obviously, we have to comply with the federal regulations as it pertains to FSMA. Now, the intentional adulteration rule, which is part of FSMA, went into effect May 26th of 2016. Now, this is important, folks, so you want to make sure you take some very good notes here, because I'm going to share with you some things that you really need to jot down and remember. And if you have customers that you work with as auditors, then you may want to share this information with them. May 26, 2016 is when the final rules were signed. Now, the FDA has already began enforcing some of those rules, so that's very important to note. Now, I want to start out by playing this short audio clip, which talks about the threats to our nation's critical infrastructure. It's only 2 minutes, but I like to use this as an introduction to kind of explain some of the threats that we face here as a nation.
Our nation's critical infrastructure. We tend to focus on malicious action. When analyzing threats to our nation's critical infrastructure, we tend to focus on malicious actions from outside actors. Of equal concern are threats from an insider, someone we have given legitimate access to information, systems, and resources. The measures we take to detect and protect against external threats may not be sufficient to address threats from insiders. A malicious insider has access and inside knowledge of the organization and uses that knowledge with the intent to cause harm. The insider may be a current employee, a former employee, or a service provider. Given the importance of our nation's critical infrastructure, the actions taken by a malicious employee or service provider could have devastating consequences. Let's look at some actual examples. A service provider employee at a nuclear facility stole 2 5-gallon containers of low-enriched uranium dioxide and then attempted to extort $100,000 by threatening to disperse the material in an unnamed U.S. city. A power company field engineer, angry with his supervisor, disabled protection systems at a substation and forced the shutdown of the entire network. More than 800,000 customers lost power as a result. 2 municipal employees used their access credentials to sabotage the system controlling the traffic lights of a major city, causing widespread traffic delays. The damage took 4 days to repair. A disgruntled supermarket meat packaging employee intentionally contaminated hamburger meat with a pesticide, causing various levels of illness in 92 consumers. Insider threats endanger the integrity and security of our workplaces and our communities. This course helps you become aware of threat indicators and actions you can take. Awareness is the first step to keeping our nation safe.
Awareness is the first step to keeping our nation safe. And that's the message, folks, that we need to make sure that we spread throughout the food and ag industry, not just food and ag, all of our critical infrastructures. And that message is that folks must be aware of what the threat potentially could be and what damage could potentially happen to our food supply. Now, as we know, the number one threat facing the United States today is the threat of ISIS and individuals that buy into the ideology of groups such as ISIS. So who are the terrorists? Who are the people that we should be concerned about? Real quickly here, international extremists such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, sympathizers and lone wolves, liberation movement, domestic terrorists, and the list goes on and on and on as to the people that would want to cause us harm. Now, this is really interesting, folks. Back in September of last year, article appeared in Newsweek magazine, and in that article, it was titled, "ISIS Supporters Call for Poisoning of Food in Grocery Stores Across the United States and in Europe." Now, my law enforcement contacts here in Washington, D.C. tells me that they were unable to substantiate this potential threat. However, it's very important that we recognize this, even though this appears to be propaganda sent out by ISIS or one of the ISIS supporting groups, we still must pay attention to it. And basically, like I said, they were calling for poisoning of food across the United States in grocery stores. Now, interestingly enough, 1 month after that article came out, in November of 2017, there was a guy, and some of you all on the webinar may remember this situation. It happened up in New York City, where there was a guy who bought into the ideology of ISIS. He rented a truck, a U-Haul truck, and then he mowed down and killed 7 people on the West Side Avenue in New York City along the Hudson. Some of you all may remember that, but here's what was really interesting about that case. The day that that happened, in November of 2017, I was actually in Syracuse, New York, conducting a site vulnerability assessment at a food facility. Now, what was interesting is I immediately, when I heard about that situation that happened in New York City, I went out as part of my vulnerability assessment and I looked at some of the vehicles, the trucks, parked on the lot at this food facility up in Syracuse. And guess what? I found 5 trucks, all with the keys in the ignition, no driver inside the vehicle, just and the engines were idling on the lot there at that food plant in Syracuse, New York. Now, interestingly enough, the trucks that we use in the food industry, folks, are exactly the same type of truck that was used over in Nice, France. Some of you all may recall a couple of years ago where a guy took a box truck, the same type that we use in the food industry, and killed 84 people. So my point is, we must recognize that these are vulnerabilities and make sure that you inform your clients and your customers that they inform their truck drivers not to leave the keys in the ignition. As a matter of fact, I took a picture of one of the keys in the ignition, and you can see it on that picture on your screen right there. I don't know if you can see the cursor, but right there is the key in the ignition. All someone had to do, someone, meaning this individual here, all he had to do was go to this food plant up in Syracuse, jump in one of these trucks, drive 52 miles south to 42nd and Broadway in New York City, and he would have been able to use that truck from the food plant and mow down as many people as he could. So that's the reality. That's why we need to make sure that we bring these types of things to the attention of management at some of the food companies that we work with. Now, let me ask you this question. What about a visitor's log? Now, each and every one of us on the webinar today, we go in and out of food facilities each and every day. Let me ask you this, though. How often are you asked to show identification upon entry? Do you have to show some type of credential? And is it part of the facility's security plan that identification is required? Now, I will tell you that many, many years of visiting food facilities, rarely does anyone ever ask me to present identification. Typically, what I sign in on the visitor's log, is what you see on your screen, Osama bin Laden. And would you believe that in 10 years, not one time has anyone ever asked to see my ID or question this? And the column where it says company affiliated, it says Taliban. Again, no one has ever questioned that. So who are the people that can cause us harm? Real quick here, we got criminals, protesters, terrorist groups, subversives, rogue or disgruntled insiders. Now, jot this down. A subversive is an individual who would compromise his or her values for a benefit. And a subversive is really the type of people or persons that we in Homeland Security are always very, very concerned about. Why? Because think about it, folks. A subversive is someone on the inside, someone that already has access to our food supply, whether it's batch products or whatever. It could even be finished products. That's a subversive, though, someone on the inside who would compromise their values and beliefs for a benefit. Now, typically, what do you think that benefit is? Well, if you said money, you're correct. So in order to be successful, the aggressor, which is one of those individuals on that previous slide that I just showed you, these are the aggressors, right? They must have access to the product and sufficient time. They must be technically capable of obtaining and producing and introducing a sufficient quantity of a suitable contaminant. They must be able to commit the crime without discovery, and they must have the behavioral resolve or the desire to contaminate food. Now, the aggressor must have technical feasibility in order to carry out their plan. They must have operational practicality, meaning the ability to succeed. They must be knowledgeable about food products from farm to fork, and they must be competent enough to plan the attack to avoid detection or elimination of the adulterant later in the manufacturing, distribution, and consumption process. Now, put yourself in the mind of an internal saboteur. And as auditors, let me share this with you. And you can do the same exact thing with your clients. I always ask plant managers, if you were the bad guy, let's say you were the Sarnia brothers, which is the Boston bombers, or some of us remember Timothy McVeigh from Oklahoma City bombing. If you're that individual, put yourself in their mindset and ask yourself, what could I do to damage my company? And just take about 10 seconds and think about that. If you were the bad guy and you ask yourself, what could you do to damage your company? What would that answer be? Well, here's the thing, folks, and this is the reality. Whatever you can think of, know that a terrorist or a disgruntled worker will actually do. So you may say, well, Rod, what are our strategies? I'm glad you asked. Here's our strategies to food defense. They're very simple, very easy. Number one, awareness. Awareness is the key to staying safe. You have to be vigilant, watchful, alert, be informed. Number two, prevention, having safeguards in place, detection. Number three, being prepared, being ready, being conscious of danger, developing plans. It's nothing worse than to not have prepared a plan in advance and then a crisis situation arises. Number 4, your response. How will you respond in a situation? Will you be able to come back? What about countermeasures? And then number 5, recovery, normalcy, getting back into business. So these are our strategies when it comes to the first line of defense. Now, know this about terrorists. Terrorists strike when and where least expected, folks. I mean, they sit back, they watch how you operate, they come into your facility as a temporary worker or as a contractor. And you all know we use a lot of contractors in the food industry. They sit back, they watch how you operate, and then they strike. Terrorists strike soft targets. My question for you today is the facilities that you work with, are they soft targets or are they hard targets? Terrorists don't have to be successful in the common sense of the term to accomplish their goals, and terrorist events are planned events. So we have a number of holidays coming up here in the United States, and as we know, the Memorial Day holiday in the United States is one of the biggest holidays of the summertime, mainly because it's the first holiday of the warm season. That's a good thing. But just think again from the perspective of the attacker. Think from the perspective of the bad guy and ask yourself, how many consumers will happily consume multiple food products this upcoming Memorial Day holiday and then July 4th holiday? Now, I've recently been doing quite a bit of work with a number of food companies, food processing companies that produce food product obviously for the masses of people, because these particular products, and I don't want to mention the product names, but these products just about reach everyone in the United States. That's a good thing. So these companies, these food processors are ramping up production at their plants in anticipation of the upcoming holiday season. That's a great thing. But here's the question. What does this mean? The holidays, the upcoming holidays, what do they mean to these two individuals? You've probably recognized that these are the Sarnea brothers. These are the Boston bombers, and needless to say, one of them is deceased, the other is in jail. But when I ask that question, what does it mean to them? I'm figuratively asking to someone with their mindset. Think about it for a minute. If you have these two individuals' mindset, you know this major holiday is coming up in the United States, and you know a lot of consumers will consume food product, what are you going to start thinking to yourself? You're going to probably start thinking, I wonder if I can get into various types of food companies to contaminate food product. Contaminated food in the United States. According to the CDC, 48 million illnesses, 128,000 hospitalizations, 3,000 deaths, $14 billion a year in terms of medical care, lost productivity, chronic health problems, and deaths. Now, it's important to note, however, that with these numbers, these are primarily related to food safety, not necessarily food defense. Okay, but nonetheless, you can see these numbers are huge. Violent extremists and terrorists considers America's agriculture and food production tempting targets, according to the FBI. Now, there is some intelligence that we have in the United States. Our law enforcement agencies have shared this with me for years now. We do have intelligence that has shown us where Al-Qaeda actually back in the 90s talked about harming the children of the United States by way of the food supply. So this isn't, this concept of contaminating food isn't new. This has been happening, and it's happened in other countries as well. So what I want to kind of shift to now is to talk about what I call goal-based food defense. Now, real quickly, you may say, well, what is goal-based food defense and why goal-based food defense? Well, I talked to a number of food processors and managers at food processing companies, and they're all scrambling right now to try to comply with FSMA. And if you haven't had the opportunity to take a look at the regulation, take a look at it. And for some, it can be very confusing. if not daunting, to have to go through that regulation. So what I want to talk about is how can you comply with FSMA and at the same time keep your people, your products, your assets, and your brand protected. And to illustrate the point, and I think you guys are going to really, really like this, because this, to me, really has illustrated the point as to understanding FSMA and at the same time understanding why we even have a food defense plan and a facility. This is what I call the Global Food Defense Food Preparedness and Response Continuum. So you have the pre-event state. This is before something happens, right? So FDP stands for Food Defense Plan. That's what companies need to be doing now, developing their food defense plan. Now, with that, you're going to focus on these areas here: identifying critical business components, conduct a vulnerability assessment. Now, the reason that's in yellow, folks, is because that's step one. This is some good information here. That's step one. You can't even write a food defense plan unless you have done a vulnerability assessment. Okay, and that's where you as auditors come in, because a number of companies is going to rely on the auditor to not necessarily conduct an audit, but an assessment. And it's important that managers understand that when you conduct a security vulnerability assessment, it's an assessment, not an audit. So sometimes you get a score for a vulnerability assessment and sometimes you don't. But the point here is that they need to understand that you're assessing their level of security at the facility, not necessarily auditing their level of security, because to audit it, you would be basing that against something. And right now, there's nothing to base it against other than FSMA and the industry best practices. Assess the threats and opportunities, develop protective measures and mitigation strategies, which is very important. Prioritize protective strategies, implement protective measures, plan and train all staff. Now remember, again, this is the pre-event state, okay? What's the goal? The goal is to develop a food defense plan, okay, in anticipation, to be better prepared, to raise awareness in case something happens. So boom, let's say something happens. Now you have your tampering event. Someone has tampered with the product, or someone has made a threat of tampering with the product. Ask yourself this question right here. Are we prepared to deal with this? Well, if you've conducted and completed your food defense plan, the answer should be yes, because part of your food defense plan is also your facility response plan. That was built into the facility, the food defense plan. Now, with your response plan, you're going to assemble your crisis response team. These are individuals who've already been identified and listed in your food defense plan. Implement your response plans, monitor business components, assess your response capability. This is an important one here. Contain the impact and the effect of whatever the tampering situation is. You should be able to do that at this point. Why? Because you've already accounted for things that could happen in your food defense plan when you develop protective measures and mitigation strategies. That's why the next one says implement mitigation. You see how it kind of works hand in hand there? Then you have recovery, getting back into business and return to normalcy. If all of these things work the way they're supposed to work, as you can see on this continuum here, it should actually take you back to the pre-event state. If we know, and see folks, this is goal-based food defense, okay? If we know, right, the pre-event state and where we want to be, the pre-event state will be less vulnerable. Why? Because we've developed a food defense plan. So the objective is, why not just work to get there now? That's the purpose of the Global Food Defense Facility Response Plan concept. Now, hopefully that helped you understand a little bit better, and actually a lot better, because I'll tell you, when I show this particular continuum to plant managers, I always hear, aha, people get it. It's almost like the light bulb turns on. They understand the whole purpose of this. Now, within the food defense plan, keep in mind you're going to be complying excuse me, with the elements and the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act intentional adulteration rule. So that's very important that I mentioned that there. Now, is the goal of food defense different than food safety? Well, food defense focuses on protecting the food supply from intentional contamination. Food safety, on the other hand, focuses on protecting the food supply from unintentional contamination, okay? They're not mutually exclusive though, okay? They're not mutually exclusive. A risk-based assessment versus a goal-based assessment, okay? In a risk-based assessment, the process focuses on identifying risk, but not necessarily security processes or solutions. In a risk-based assessment, significantly fewer risks will be identified if good security measures are already in place. A goal-based assessment understands the purpose as to why we conduct vulnerability assessments and do food defense plans and emergency crisis plans in advance. Establish appropriate goals to achieve the purpose. Define the goals, not the methods to achieve them. Okay, remember we're talking goal-based assessments now. And define what needs to be demonstrated to ensure that the goals are achieved. Goal-based food defense, meeting the goals, is less subjective than risk-based assessments and more objective in nature. Now, a goal-based food defense assessment does not advise how to do it or what tools to use, but it establishes achievable goals and measures the results of the efforts. That solely complies with the Food Safety Modernization Act right there. And you get quantifiable results, okay? So once basic security measures are in place, additional risk are more easily identified. I'm going to give you some examples here in a minute. You'll understand better what I mean. You'll clearly see the difference between risk-based assessments and goal-based assessments. So what is it that we're trying to protect? We're trying to protect our people, our products, our assets, and our brand, and the integrity of our brand. Ask yourself what credible threats or other dangers could occur at your facility, to your people, to your assets, and to your brand. Now, one of the things we always talk about when we talk about food defense, we talk about terrorism and terrorist activity or terroristic-like activity and threats. But here's the thing, folks, when you conduct a vulnerability assessment and you write a security plan, whether you're doing it for a client or if you're doing it for yourself, don't forget about natural threats. Don't forget about accidental threats that could exist. Let me give you a very quick example. About a year ago, I went to do a vulnerability assessment at a major food facility in Fairfield, New Jersey. And it was about 7:30 a.m. And so when I got to the block or the street, the roadway where the food plant was located, I turned onto that street. And as soon as I turned onto that street, I noticed there was a Michelin tire factory, an active tire factory, literally steps away from the building where the food plant was located, where I was going to do a vulnerability assessment. And I said to myself, oh no, I need to make a note of this tire factory. Now, just take 5 seconds and think to yourself the answer to this question that I'm about to ask you. Why did I feel it was necessary to make a note of the fact that there was a tire manufacturer facility less than a few steps away from the food plant? Just take 5 seconds and think about that. Well, if you thought to yourself, because in the event of a fire at the tire factory, obviously, whenever tires burn, rubber burns like that, you can potentially have dangerous and deadly fumes in the air. 9 times out of 10, if there's a fire on that block, the fire department is going to want to evacuate the entire block. So as a result, in my vulnerability assessment at the food plant, I informed them and gave them a recommendation to install a windsock at the top of their building. That way, if there is a major fire at that tire facility, the employees evacuate from the food plant, the first thing you want to do is look up at that windsock and obviously evacuate in the direction that's opposite of the wind flow. Managers thought that was dynamic. They've been there for years and never thought about that. It's just something that never crossed their mind. So my point here is, don't forget about the natural things that could occur. So what is the relative likelihood of occurrence for each of the threats? Probability should be measured based on the effectiveness of barriers in place, not based on experience. So let me give you an example. Take a close look at the image on your screen now. And this is a food plant that I visited not long ago, and they store chemicals, equipment, things like that in the cage. But I was told they've never had an incident that has occurred before in terms of someone stealing chemicals or equipment out of this cage. And that's why it's unlocked, because nothing has ever happened. Now, do you base likelihood on something that has ever happened before, or do you base likelihood on the effectiveness of the barriers that you have in place? The answer is the latter. You base likelihood based on the effectiveness of the barrier. So when you look at this particular cage, folks, what should happen? They have the cage there. This is great, but it needs to be closed and it needs to be locked. That's how you're going to measure whether or not your security measures are effective. And again, this is a clear example of that's the goal. The goal is to keep those items in this cage safe and secure away from someone who potentially could have ill intent. But you don't say, well, we're going to leave it open because it's never happened before. You go ahead and close it and you lock it. You put a lock on there, and then that clearly shows you that the level of security or countermeasure. See, now that would be an example of a mitigation strategy. Just make a note of that, okay? Because the FDA talks a lot about mitigation strategies. That would be a mitigation strategy to mitigate or reduce the likelihood of something happening. You close the gate, you close the cage, you put a lock on it. Now, I have several other pictures I'm going to get to in a minute, and I'm going to ask you those same questions. And I think pictures, as we all know, says 1,000 words. You really learn a lot from looking at situations. So the question is, what should be done now and in the future before and during a situation or an event to protect people, products, and to ensure that our products are safe and secure? The other question that I'm often asked is, how much security is enough security? That's a very good question, folks. How much security is enough security? And it really just depends on what. And jot this down. This is good information. Trust me when I tell you, the level of security that you have at a food plant should be commensurate with the risk. The level of security that you have at a food plant should equal, commensurate means equal, with the risk. So number one, okay, 5 things I'm going to share with you here, goals. Number 1, facilitate movement of people, control of people in and around the facility. Now, this includes employees, contractors, and let me underline the word contractors. That's a huge vulnerability, folks. You know, we allow contractors sometimes that we don't even know that well full access to our facilities. If I'm the bad guy, if I'm Timothy McVeigh, okay, I'm going to come into a facility as a contractor because I think, based on my experience of many years of doing this, that's the best way, the easiest way to get into a facility, a food processing facility. Temporary workers, service persons, truck drivers, facilitate the movement of these people. Every access door, emergency exit, egress door, overhead door, window vent, and other openings should be controlled to deter unauthorized, undetected entry. Now, this last box you will see on all the next 5 slides for each goal. Management should be able to demonstrate that these measures are indeed effective. Why do I put that there? I'll tell you why. Because that is direct language from FSMA, okay? That comes directly out of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Management should be able to demonstrate that the measures that you have in place to facilitate the movement of people are indeed effective. Background checks and reference checks. All right, so what's the goal? The goal is to ensure that the backgrounds of persons who will be allowed unescorted access in the plant has been properly vetted. Now, background checks may include verifying information of employment, former addresses, former employment, criminal convictions, whatever it may be, but be sure your background check complies with local laws. Goal number 3, site-specific vulnerability assessment. The goal is to ensure that facility vulnerabilities are identified and mitigated. To achieve this, you must conduct a vulnerability assessment. Identify areas which will require additional security measures or solution, and be especially mindful of the 4 key activity types. And I'm going to talk about the key activity types in a minute. Now, there's that box again. Facility management should be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of these measures and or mitigation strategies. Now, let me just mention one other thing real quickly while I'm on this particular slide talking about site-specific vulnerability assessments. I'll give you a little tip here. Site-specific vulnerability assessments should not only be conducted during the day. Now, some of you all are going to find that very interesting, okay? And this strictly comes from experience, and I've been talking about this a lot lately, and there's a lot of discussion now in the food industry and even with the FDA regarding that statement. You know, what I've found over the past few years, a lot of these folks that's out doing vulnerability assessments, they conduct the assessment between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. But that's not the times that things happen. That's not the time that the bad guy plans on. The bad guy, the would-be or wannabe terrorists, they're going to come under the cover of darkness. So when I conduct a vulnerability assessment, part of the assessment is done at night. And in addition to that, some of the assessment is conducted on weekends. That's when these things are going to happen. The terrorist doesn't operate between 9 and 5 p.m. That's just unrealistic, folks. So that's a good tidbit of information as an auditor, that you'll really capture the attention of your clients when you start talking like that, because guess what? That's something that even the FDA overlooked. And I've been in discussion with them. They actually thanked me for bringing that to their attention. Things happen at night and on weekends, not necessarily between 9 and 5. Now, I talked a little bit about the FDA's mitigation strategies database. I have this link here. You know, write this down, jot this down. Take a look at the FDA mitigation strategies database. Oftentimes when I conduct a vulnerability assessment with the recommendations and mitigation strategies, I'll link it directly to the mitigation strategies database. So if you just Google this, it's available to you. Excuse me. And take a look at it. It has good information if you need guidance in terms of what some mitigation strategy should be to respond and to develop some countermeasures for what you've identified. Now, I mentioned real quickly that I was going to talk about key activity types. Now, there's 4 key activity types. Now, check this out. The FDA has paid particular attention to the key activity types, and they talk about this on a regular basis. As a matter of fact, most FDA auditors, this is all they focus on when they talk about intentional adulteration at a food plant. They focus on these key activity types, and I'm going to go through each one pretty quickly. But before I talk about the key activity types, keep this in mind as I go through the next 4 slides. With each key activity type, what we need to do is develop red zones. It's a quick, easy, inexpensive fix to not only comply with FSMA, but at the same time, really help protect your facility and your product. So here's the example, folks, where this concept of red zones come from. Now, a number of plants are starting to implement these red zones. I got this concept from the airports. In the United States, every airport out by the airplanes on the tarmac, those are considered red zones. I don't know if most people know that who doesn't work in law enforcement. Law enforcement, of course, knows it. But those are red zones. What does that mean? That means that if you're going to be working out around the airplanes, you shall, okay, And that's the language that TSA uses: have your identification visible at all times by way of a armband, of a color-coded Velcro armband. And that's why I have the picture of the armband there. And you notice it's red. And the red is for different levels of access. So that's the only reason why I have red there. But you can have green, yellow, purple, and it all means something different. Now, to enter into the areas around the airplanes, now think of a food plant. As I go through this real quickly, folks, this is some good stuff. Think of a food plant. When you go into these areas, every airport, you see this sign: restricted area, do not enter, authorized personnel only. We need to have that same type of signage to not only comply with FSMA, but to keep people out of these areas, these key activity type areas that should not be there. You also find signage at every airport where it says airport ID must be displayed on the outermost garment at all times. That's the legislation, that's the regulation for the airports. And do you know that if there's individuals working around the airplanes without their ID badge showing, their color-coded armband showing, that 2 incidents like that, and they are banned from working around airplanes, any airport here in the United States. And then there's signage that says challenge anyone not displaying airport ID. Again, we need to use that same concept when we talk about the key activity types at a food plant. It's like I said, it's a quick, easy way to comply with FSMA and to keep these areas safe. So the first key activity type is bulk liquid receiving and holding, okay? Again, think of the red zone. Making sure that there's adequate cameras in this area, making sure that only authorized individuals that should be in this area is in this area. Liquid storage and handling, same thing. Should be a red zone, restricted to only those persons authorized. And let's say you're not a red zone level employee. Let's say you're a green level. Let's say green is for temporary workers. Well, does that mean that you cannot go into these areas? No, it doesn't mean that. You still can go into those areas. However, you must be accompanied by a red zone level employee. And you have to enforce that, folks. This is a great concept and it works. Another key activity type is secondary ingredient handling, preparation, rework areas. Same thing. And these are key activity types that the FDA has focused on. And then the fourth type, mixing rooms, blending rooms, homogenizing rooms. So let me give you a quick example as to why I think, based on my experience, this area is really, really a key activity type, and you need to have cameras there. You know, I do investigations, tampering investigations from time to time. And I just had a case last September out in California, as a matter of fact, at a food plant where someone was taking, there's a little metal piece in earplugs. Some of you all on the call are familiar with this, you know, the earplugs that we wear in food plants. Well, some of the earplugs contain a very tiny metal piece. And what someone at this plant was doing was taking the little earplugs, the metal piece out of the earplugs, throwing them over into the finished product. Now, here's what you're thinking. Well, shouldn't the foreign object detector capture that information if somebody's going to try to put something like that in? And the answer is yes. And the foreign object detector did, in fact, work. However, there were 4 incidents of this happening. Now, why was this happening? As an investigator, obviously, we're trying to determine the motive. This particular food plant was going through a lot of issues with their union. Folks wanted to get raises, things of that nature. And what we believe is someone was trying to get the attention of management by deliberately putting some foreign objects over into the product. The point I want to make here, though, with this key activity type is that, guess what? There were no cameras. There was no cameras in that area. This is a key activity type. Not only were there no cameras, when I got out there to start the investigation, I wanted to know who all that came through that facility had access to this critical key activity type room. Guess what the answer was? Most of you all on the call know what the answer is. Everyone had access. Well, if everyone has access to this area, you'll never be able to figure out who could be committing this horrible act of throwing these objects, foreign objects, into the product. So now, as a result of that situation, which cost this company a lot of money, by the way, because they had to dispose of a lot of product, now they have cameras. Now the mixing room at that particular plant is a red zone. Very limited number of people can enter into that area. Goal number 4, investigate and mitigate any security breaches. Again, actual or suspected breaches of security, such as alarm sounding, break-ins, strangers found in the building. These things should be investigated immediately. There's that box again. Facility management should be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of these measures or mitigation strategies. And again, folks, this comes directly out of FSMA. And then goal number 5, develop plans, policies, and procedures. This should include training all personnel on food defense, including your frontline workers. Your frontline workers are key, okay? I have to tell you, they are the ones that's out there each and every day. If somebody's going to do something at a food facility, it's going to be that frontline worker that's going to see them and stop them, or at least bring the situation to the attention of a manager. Now, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to definitely get to a few of the pictures, but I do want to show you a little bit more about the intentional adulteration rule, because your clients are going to ask you this, so you need to know. Every food facility, processing facility, shall possess a food defense plan. Now, on the FDA's website, they do have the food defense plan builder. A number of companies use that. I actually use that food defense plan builder when companies ask me to write their food defense plan. I'll use that as a guide. It's not bad. It's much better than it used to be. Have conducted a vulnerability assessment. Remember, I told you have to do that to comply. And then management of an emergency response goal. The FDA focuses on 3 primary forms of intentional adulteration: acts of terrorism against the food and ag supply, disgruntled workers, and economically motivated adulteration, which is also known as food fraud. Some of us are familiar with food fraud, okay? So the FDA focuses on those 3 areas. Prepare and implement a written food defense plan, conduct a vulnerability assessment, develop actionable process steps, mitigation strategies for procedures for monitoring, corrective actions, and verification, and provide security awareness training for your employees. Now, the last few slides here, I want to talk quickly about some of the more commonly found vulnerabilities at food plants. Real quickly, lack of a well-documented and practiced food defense plan in place. And this is after conducting maybe about 300 to 400 vulnerability assessments over the past 6 to 7 years. These are the commonalities that I have found. Very few security situational response protocols in place. Lack of or non-existing facility parking program or policies in place. No way to identify who's parked on the company lot. Huge area. That's an area that companies really need to address. Very few and oftentimes enforced visitor policies. Identification of visitors is not being checked and verified. No security protocol training for frontline workers, contractors, or other visitors to the facility. And let me just put an asterisk by that one. Think for yourself, even as auditors, when you go to a food facility, how many of those facilities, before you are allowed entry into the plant, how many of those managers at those facilities sit down with you and go over the security protocols? I'm not talking just the GMPs. Okay, we all know that every food plant has GMPs they usually review with the visitor. But I'm talking the security policies. And if you haven't thought about it, the next time you visit a plant, just ask yourself, I wonder if they're going to go over the evacuation policy with me before we go into the plant. I wonder if they're going to go over with me the response here that I should do if there's a bomb threat, if there's an active shooter in the building. These types of things, these are vulnerabilities because companies aren't thinking about these things in advance. Lack of emergency evacuation planning and drills, including outdated facility evacuation maps. No procedure in place for quick investigation of suspected tampering events. Product seal and lock procedures are not developed, and where they are developed, they're not enforced. Now, product seal. seals and locks, huge area for the FDA. So make sure, I mean, underline this, put an asterisk by that one, right? That your clients understand that their seal program needs to be consistent. What do I mean by that? Who's putting the seal on finished loads that's going out? Who's removing the seal on bulk ingredients? It should be an employee of the company verifying the seal first, of course, and then removing that seal. That should not be left up to the driver, obviously, especially if the driver is an independent driver. Facility perimeter and interior doors are not numbered for quick reference in an emergency. No emergency action training for employees for an active shooter. Lack of or inadequate outside perimeter lighting. See, that's another one, folks. And again, this is some real good stuff here. Some people, when they do vulnerability assessments, they forget to do the assessment, what we like to call in law enforcement, under the cover of darkness or at night, right? There's a lot of vulnerabilities that you will identify at night, including areas where the lighting isn't that great. That could be a vulnerability. That's why part of your vulnerability assessment should be conducted at night. Lack of proper security signage around the facility, the perimeter of the facility. Again, that's another huge vulnerability that I find. There's no trespassing signs, no signage indicating no weapons or no videotaping allowed. These types of security signs are essential for any type of facility. Inadequate or not enforced employee locker inspection policy. So we see a number of these things there. 3 types of security systems: integrated, graduated, and layered. Now, only a few slides here, but a lot of managers really like these slides because it helps them understand how they should form their security system and barriers at their facility. Now, the integrated security system is a security system where all of your measures work in tandem with each other. So you may say, well, what do you mean by that, Rod? Okay. So let's say you have someone go into a particular room. Before they can, let's say the laboratory, good example, the facility laboratory. Well, all facility laboratories should be locked and card accessible. So the way an integrated security system works, as soon as you swipe your card to gain access to the laboratory, perhaps the door will open at that point, but there's a camera on the inside of the laboratory that automatically kicks on and starts recording activity inside the laboratory. That's an integrated security system. Cameras and the door access device work in tandem with each other. Okay? The layered security system is rings of security around whatever it is that you're trying to protect. Okay? So the would-be criminal has to deal with a series of security measures causing delay and greater potential for detection because of the increased time required to complete the criminal act. The third type of security system is the graduated security system, okay? And this is the closer you get to the target, the level of security increases, okay? So the level of security is heightened. So here's a quick example of the layered security system, okay? You see number 3 there on the image on your screen. Let's say that's the target. So in a food facility, let's say that's the production plant or the batch ingredient area. Remember the key activity types I was just talking about? Let's say that's a key activity type. Well, your first level of security may be all the way on the outside where you see number 1. And that could be outside the building. But as you get closer to your target, remember this is the layered security example. As you get closer to your target, there's another layer of security where you see number 2. And then, of course, right at the target, there's a third level of security. Here's another example of a layered security type of environment. So you see the blue circle there. That blue circle contains the area that should be the highly secure building. This could be the production area. This could be the laboratory area, whatever. But as you can see, there's various levels or layers at this particular building, right, that you'd have to go through in order to gain access to that key activity type area. And then here's a third and final example whereby your layers of security can start way out on the street, literally. And you know where it starts, folks? Again, this is some good information. Your first layer of security is the no trespassing signage. That's your first layer of security, no trespassing signage. So if someone does in fact trespass on your property, right, then they've already started to breach your security measures. Frontline workers, as I indicated earlier, are critical and key, and they should be provided with additional food training in food defense. Now, I want to just quickly, at the last few slides here, show you a few actual pictures from some previous vulnerability assessments that I've conducted. These are the things, folks, that you really want to look for. Now, what's behind this fence are the sugar ingredient tanks, bulk sugar tanks for this particular company. And as I was conducting the vulnerability assessment, voila, this is what I come across. This lock obviously should be locked. Anyone now has access to those tanks. Here's another example at a different plant. This leads to their ammonia room, believe it or not. This is huge for the FDA. They will be all over this. And as you can see there, someone has decided to use a prop rock, is what I like to call it, and prop the door open for whatever reason. Here's another example of a plant down in Atlanta where I was visiting recently. And these are the things that you really want to check for when you do a vulnerability assessment. Now, this door is in the rear of this facility. And just to make a long story short, because I know we don't have a lot of time, we discovered just from my vulnerability assessment that they had at this plant theft going on in the middle of the night. And they never, meaning management, never thought to check these doors every night. They just assume if the door is closed, it's locked. And as you can see here, that's not the case. But what was even worse is this other picture I want to show you real quick. This one here. This is a plant, and this was just this past December conducting an assessment at a plant in Florida where someone actually pried off part of the latch so that they can come back to the facility in the middle of the night and commit theft. And actually, we did a sting operation, and we were able to arrest 2 individuals at this plant as a result of what we found through the vulnerability assessment. Now, I talked earlier about seals, and I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but I just want to make sure a few of these things that I don't want you to miss. Make sure that you can account for seals, okay? And these are just some pictures from seals that I've taken at food plants from doing vulnerability assessments. Here's the thing. If somebody were to remove a handful of these seals, how would the company know it? And there's so many things, folks, you can do with stolen seals. So seals need to be, and this comes from the intentional adulteration rule, seals need to be protected, unused seals specifically. Not only should they be protected, monitored, they also need to be accounted for, okay? Here's another example, doing a vulnerability assessment, rear of the facility. What do you think that cylinder block is there for? Well, they probably prop that door open from time to time, which they are not supposed to do. Here's just another example of a plant I was visiting, and I showed them where the assembly point on the outside, this is important, so pay close attention to this. At a food facility, at any facility, but we're talking food and ag here, your assembly point or muster points should be indicated on the outside. So most companies have at least 2, some 3 assembly points. So here's an assembly point that we came across. This is down in Irving, Texas. We came across this as we were doing a vulnerability assessment. So this is good. It shows what the assembly point is. The problem here, and I wonder if any of you all can see what the problem is here. On this gate, this door, there's a padlock, right? So the assembly point is on the inside of this gate. The problem is if there's an active shooter at the facility, employees are going to run out of the building and they're going to probably run to an area that's one of their assembly points. But by having that padlock on this gate, now they realize as a result of this assessment, that's not a good thing because it would trap people's movements in an active shooter situation, which would be even worse. So what this company has already done, as a matter of fact, this is the plant manager, he's already changed this, and he's put a crash bar on that outer gate. So you can go out that gate now, and it will just send off an alarm. But no one, their movement is no longer tracked. That's a real good catch there. Just a couple of more pictures here, and then we'll conclude. We're all familiar with this. We have these covers on ladders, as you see, and it obviously it leads to the top of the ingredient silo or storage tank. But what folks fail to realize is that usually on the other side of this cover is a padlock, right? But on the other side, what's holding the cover on are 2 bolts. So all you have to do is unscrew these bolts, and this cover will come right open. You don't even have to break the lock. So let me ask you real quick, folks, what is the fix for this? What would you recommend to your client? Well, if you said spot weld or tack weld these bolts, you are correct. That's all you have to do. Now, if someone wants to get up here with ill intent, they can't just simply unscrew the bolts. What they have to do is break the bolts. That tells you someone has been up there with ill intent. A couple of more pictures here. Obviously, this is the product intake line, bulk intake line. We see the filter here, the breathing element, but the bigger vulnerability, believe it or not, is right here. I don't know if you can see these O-rings. This is huge. Now, the good news is over several years of doing this, I've noticed where a lot of companies now are making the change from these O-rings. They're using solid rings. Use solid rings, because you know why? This here is like a keychain. So all the bad guy has to do is just finagle this ring off the lock, open the cap, put the contaminant in the line, put the cap back on, and then just finagle this back on. How easy is that? But if you use solid rings, or you could tack weld these rings, the bad guy has to break the rings in order to get in there. And then, of course, that would tell you right away someone has been in that line with ill intent. A couple more pictures here. Laboratories, as I indicated earlier, this is the biggie for the FDA, so make sure you share this with your clients. Laboratories at food facilities need to be locked, okay, and card accessible, okay, and monitored. And so any chemicals that you have in the laboratory need to be locked. Here's just an example of a chemical storage cabinet at a laboratory recently that I visited. You see what the vulnerability is there? They left the key in the lock. Again, here's another plant that I visited. Notice the security sign on the door. That sign says, "Do not open, alarm will sound," and as we can see, that's not the case. And then last but not least, this one here is an extra key card that I found while conducting a vulnerability assessment outside of this food plant. This is in St. Louis, our friends in St. Louis at a food plant. And they leave an extra key card on the outside for those employees that forget or have forgotten their key card to access the building. It just simply doesn't make any sense. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to conclude with this slide here. Chemical storage rooms should be locked and secure. Hopefully, folks, with this webinar, this short webinar, you were able to get some information that's going to be very beneficial for you and to some of your clients. And if I can encourage all of you, if you have any questions or anything like that, please reach out to me. Let us know what we can do to help. And remember, at the end of the day, don't just see something, do something. And with that, I will conclude. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And Laura, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Rod. This ends today's presentation. Thanks for listening.